vanishing folklore and beliefs.
Cædmon the Cowherd, from Early English Hero Tales, public domain reading. A very great modern poet, Coleridge, who wrote The Ancient Mariner, said that prose was words in their best order, but that poetry was the best words in their best order. This is a simple and good definition of poetry. Yet there is even more than their best words in their best order in the room beyond the door over which is written poetry. Perhaps, however, beautiful words in their best order would always teach us to find what is beautiful and to love the good. I do not know. Do you? Cædmon's poem, written about 670, marks the beginning of English poetry in Great Britain, for Beowulf was first sung in another land, the land of the conquerors of England, before it was brought to British soil. The verses of Cædmon's poetry are as stormy as the sea, which beats at the bottom of the cliffs of Whitby, on which rose the monastery of Stronshall. Cædmon was at first a servant in this monastery, but when the power to sing came to him, it lifted not only Cædmon himself to something better than he had been, it has also lifted men and women ever since to better their ways of thinking and feeling, and to greater happiness than they would have ever led without English poetry. Bede, who wrote about Cædmon, said, "He did not learn the art of poetry from men, nor of men, but from God." Cædmon sang many songs, chiefly songs about stories in the Bible. Our first poetry was religious. Dark and true and tender is the north, and true and tender is all great English poetry, since that most precious of all the golden doors was thrown open in the great palace of English literature. Another almost more interesting than the stories which Cædmon resung for the world, is the story of the way the gift of song came to Cædmon. One day a little boy stood by a fishing boat from which he had just leaped. He dug his toe in the sand and looked up to the edge of a rocky cliff above him. "What dost see, lad?" said his uncle, who was tossing his catch of fish to the sand. "Creatures of the mist in the clouds yonder." "Nay, uncle," answered Finian, "there is no Grendel in the clouds. Last night at the hall a man sang to the harp that Grendel was a moor treader. Also he told of the deeds of the hero Beowulf, and he had said that Beowulf had killed Grendel. Finian's eyes were on the distant moor, which was the colour of flame in the evening light. Already twinkling above were little stars bright as the sheen of elves. There he knew, for everybody said so, lived elf and giant and monster. There in the moor pools lived the water elves. Across its flame of heather strode mighty march-gangers like Grendel, and in the dark places of the mountains lived a dragon, crouched above its pile of gold and treasure. There stood the miraculous tree of great size on which were carved the figures of beasts and birds, and strange letters which told what gods the heathen worshipped before the gentle religion of Christ was brought to England. There lived the wolf-man too, so friendless and wild that he became the comrade of the wolves which howled in those dark places. There lived a bear, old and terrible, and the wild boar, rooting up acorns with its huge curved tusks. Nearer the village was the wolf's head tree, more terrible tree than any in the mysteries of the forest and fenland. This was the gallows on which the village folk hung those who did evil. Finnan could see the tree where it stood alone in the sunset light, and he heard the rough cawing of ravens as they settled down into its dark branches to roost. "Caw, caw," crowed one raven. "Bad man, bad man." "Caw, caw," sang another raven. "Bad." Then they flapped their wings and settled to their sleep. "Uncle," Finnan said, "I will go up to the cliffside." The fisherman looked up. He heard the chanting from the church, and saw an immense white cross upright on the cliff's edge. But he knew not of what adventure little Finnan was thinking. "Aye," he said, "go. Perhaps you will see the blessed Hild." So it came about that little Finnan climbed the cliff on that evening which was to prove a night wonderful in its miracle. There was born that night that which, like the love of Christ, has made children's lives better and happier. Finnan reached the top of the cliff by those steps which were cut into it, and then took the main road, paved and straight, which led towards the great hall. He went along slowly under the apple trees, and he saw a black-haired Welsh woman drawing water. Little children not so big as Finnan were sitting up on the steps by their mothers, who were spinning in the doorways, and he passed a dog gnawing on a bone and flung to it for its supper. A cobbler laying by his tools, looking up, saw Finnan and greeted him. A jeweller was fixing ornaments on a huge horn he had polished. Carpenters were leaving a little cottage which they were building. The roads was full of men, swineherds and cowherds, ploughboys and woodchoppers, from the forests beyond, gardeners and shepherds, all on their way to the great hall. Some men were in armour, their long hair floating over their shoulders. Inside the windows, which in those days contained no window glass, torches and firelight would soon begin to flame, and mead would be passed. Already a loud horn was calling all who would come. Suddenly something sharp stabbed Finnan, and he cried out. A man, a woman, and a little child came rushing from one of those household yards, flapping their garments and screaming, "Bees! The bees!" They had just found their precious hive empty. The bees had swarmed, and unless they could find them, there would be no more sweet-smelling mead made from honey in that household that year. Another bee stung Finnan, and there were they, clinging to a low apple just above his head. They hung in a great cluster like a bunch of dark grapes. "Dame," said a cowherd who was in the road to the people who were crying out for the bees, "yonder lad knows where the bees are." Finnan rubbed his head and looked up at the angry humming swarm. "Aye," he said, and laughed. "Throw gravel on the swarming bees," called the cowherd Cædmon. The man and woman and Finnan looked for gravel and took handfuls of the gravel from the roadside and flung them over the bees, and sang again and again, "Never to the wood fly ye wildly more." And then they laughed, and the bees began to swarm. "Now," said Cædmon, who was a wise cowherd, "hang veneria on the hive, and if ye would have them safe lay on the hive, a plant of madder, then can not lure them away. When they reached the hall, folk were already eating inside. Little Finnan saw Cædmon go in quietly, for Cædmon was attached to the Abbess Hild's monastery, and had a right to go in and eat. Inside they were singing for the sake of mirth, and the torches and the firelight were flaming. Through the open window, for windows were always open then, and the word window literally meant wind-eye, Finnan saw the harp being passed from one to another. They sang many songs as the harp passed from hand to hand, songs of war and songs of home. But when the harp was passed to Cædmon, who had charmed the bees, he shook his head sorrowfully, saying that he could not sing, and got up sad and ashamed, and went out. Little Finnan wanted to shout through the window to him to sing about the bees. He did not dare, for he was afraid of being discovered. Instead, he followed behind Cædmon. He wished to ask him why he could not sing. This he did not dare to do either, but he went on to the fold where the cowherd had gone to care for the cattle. And there on the edge of the fold, the little boy, unseen by the cowherd, fell asleep. Shortly after, Cædmon too fell asleep. It must have been near the middle of the night, when the cliffs and the stars were one, and all were shining and dancing with the sheen of millions and millions of elves, and the sea down below the cliff was singing a mighty lullaby, that little Finnan started wide awake, hearing a voice speak. "Cædmon," spoke a man, who stood beside the sleeping cowherd. "Sing me something." Cædmon drowsily answered, "I cannot sing anything. Therefore went I away from the mirth and came here, for I know not how to sing." Again the mysterious stranger spoke. "Yet you could sing." And Finnan heard the sleep-bound voice of Cædmon ask, "What shall I sing?" "Sing to me," said the stranger, "the beginning of all things." And at once Cædmon began to sing in a strong voice, and very beautifully, the praise of God who made this world, and his song had all the beat of sea waves in it, sometimes little waves that lapped gently on the shore and bore in beautiful shells and jeweled seaweed, but more often its rhythm was as mighty as ocean waves that tossed big ships. Then the wandering stranger, hearing the beauty of the song, vanished. Cædmon awoke from his sleep, and he remembered all that he had sung, and the vision that had come to him, and he was glad. He arose and went to the Abbess Hild to tell her what had happened to him, the least of her servants. In the presence of many wise men did Hild bid Cædmon tell his dream and to sing his verses. And he did as he was told, and it was plain to all that an angel had visited Cædmon. The Abbess Hild took him to the monastery, and she ordered that everything be done for him. And Cædmon became the first and one of the greatest of English poets. And even as Christ was born in a manger in Bethlehem, English poetry was born in a cattle fold, in a town which was called Stronshall, which means the Bay of the Beacon. And to mankind, since Cædmon, the first English poet, English song has been a beacon to all the world. If you open a book written in the English of today, it is easy to read it, just as easy as to understand the speech we use among one another. But the English of 15 or 1600 years ago would be difficult to read. There is an illustration of this English in a line from Dor's Lament. Thus offer od thisis swa meg. It is easy to pick out word for word and see that it means, that was overcome, so may this be. The English in that great palace, some of whose doors are more than 1200 years old, is the same English, just as the oak tree, 200 years old, is the same oak tree, though different than when it was planted. But you would find it difficult to read the English in which Cædmon wrote his great poems. Old English poetry, too, seems as different from the poetry of today as the language we speak seems different from the language they used to speak. For one thing, Old English poetry did not have rhymes. Little lamb, who made thee? Dost thou know who made thee? Gave thee life and bade thee feed by the stream and o'er the mead? Gave thee clothing of delight, softest clothing woolly bright? Gave thee such a tender voice, making all the vales rejoice? Little lamb, who made thee? Dost thou know who made thee? This poem was written somewhat over 100 years ago by William Blake, but it is modern and part of that brightest and most beautiful rooms of all English poetry, 19th century poetry. What is a rhyme? You can tell if you will study this stanza from the Léamh. You will see that thee of the first line rhymes with thee of the second, that feed and mead rhyme, and that delight and bright rhyme, just as voice and rejoice. Old English poetry was different too, in that it did not count the syllables in a line of poetry. If you drum on the table and count the syllables of the first and second lines, you will see that each has 6, and the following 6 lines have 7 syllables each, and the last 2 6 each. Then if you drum a little more, you will see that each of the first 2 lines has 3 accents or stresses, and the following 6 4 accents or stresses each. Then you ask, what was this old English poetry like? Even if the syllables were not counted and there was no rhyme, it had accents just as our modern poetry has. Every line was divided into half verses by a pause, as, for example, warriors of winter's young with words spake. There are 2 accented syllables in the first half of this line and 1 in the second. And now, instead of rhyme, what do you think the old English poetry had? Alliteration. That is a big word, but it is not nearly so difficult as it seems, for it means simply the repetition of the same letter at the beginning of 2 or more words. Here it is, the letter W, that is repeated. It was poetry with alliteration and stress, which little Finian heard on that night so long ago, when the angel came to Cædmon and commanded him to sing.